Okay, hello everybody. It's George from Ireland here. So this video is going to be explaining how that there is no white genocide in South Africa. This is a pernicious myth which has been put around by ill-intentioned people for a few years now. First of all, I've got to define my terms. Well, what is genocide? Well, Raphael Lemkin invented this just after the Second World War because there was no term for the deliberate killing of people on the basis of their ethnicity or faith, despite the fact that genocide has been going on throughout recorded history. So genus as in race in Latin and cidere as in to kill. So that's what it is. And people say, or could be genocide even if a single member of that group is killed for his or her ethnicity. Okay, so it's a lie to say that genocide is going on in South Africa. Now, occasionally people have been killed for their ethnicity, black people or white people, in recent years, not for being black as such, I don't think, I could be mistaken, but for whichever subgroup of black people they are. We see over 80% of South Africans are black. Mixed race people, as in partly black, partly white, they're known as coloured people in South Africa. There are a few more percent. But the black population of South Africa is subdivided into many tribes, each with their own language. There's about a dozen indigenous languages of South Africa, like Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, Shangaan. More I don't know. So I'm not saying that the people of the different black groups hate each other. By no means. I don't think most of them do, but perhaps a few of them do. There are interethnic asperities in South Africa, unfortunately, as there are in different parts of the world. So if one person is killed because of his or her ethnicity or religion, I don't think that's sufficient to amount to the genocide going on. That is an individual act of genocide, but that doesn't mean there's genocide per se. I mean, by that token, we'd have to say there's genocide going on in the United States against Jewish people, against Muslims, against Hispanic people, against black people, against whites as well. Now, that would be preposterous because it's not sufficiently large scale for that to be an accurate description of what pertains there right now. So I'm trying to light myself a little bit without looking like too much of a bogeyman. So it is a pernicious myth to say that there is white genocide occurring in the Republic of South Africa. And white anxiety is growing in various countries because whites, as a proportion of the human race, were declining. Now, that disturbs some whites very deeply. Doesn't bother me. I don't care two hoots who's white, who's not. But for white nationalists and white supremacists, it matters very much indeed. So certain demagogues can play on this like a fiddle and really heighten this white worry. So white genocide is nothing new. As a trope, it's a well-known meme of the white supremacist movement, has been for well over a century. There's this replacement theory to do with in white majority countries with immigration, with the birth rate of non-white groups and so on. What else? So it's a favoured talking point of white supremacists. They're taking over. They're dangerous. We must hammer them, repress them. Before they do that, they drive us out. So those people who feel spite towards non-whites, speaking to a white African, this chap's ancestor spent some generations in Zambia. He said being a white African and whites are only 1% of the population of the African continent, he said, is a mixture between potency and vulnerability. So it's very deceitful to say that there's white genocide going on in South Africa. Why then would tens of thousands of white tourists from around the world go to South Africa every year? It just doesn't make sense if their group is full of chop. It doesn't withstand a moment's scrutiny. And we should all gainstand such flagrant lying, especially when it's intended to increase interethnic hostility. So whites comprise about 8% of the population of South Africa, but only 1.8% of murder victims are white. So whites are less likely to be murdered than other racial groups, much less likely. So you'd have to say there's black genocide if you're going to go by the statistics, obviously mostly carried out by black people. Now, as I say, you could regard the black people of South Africa as belonging to one of about a dozen tribes. I hope the word tribe doesn't come across as demeaning. It's not intended to be in my mouth. And the whites are subdivided into those who speak Afrikaans as their mother tongue, those who are Anglophones by their original language, and obviously they're subdivided. Some of the whites they're of Greek ethnicity or Lebanese ethnicity or whatever, Italian ancestry, some are British, and on and on. So bogus, inflated statistics are put about by the white supremacists who want to increase animosity towards non-white people. And this, it's like Mark Twain said, "The lies, damned lies, and statistics." And a lie's got halfway around the world before the truth has got its pants on. It's awfully difficult to refute some of this, to rebut this, and unfortunately, these unchallenged false assertions get very far. And it's once somebody's got a false idea into his head, it's very often very difficult to get out of his head because it's embedded there. So some of the wealthy whites, they live behind high walls with barbed wire on top, and they've got armed guards, mostly black guards, guard dogs, and so on. Security TV. Some of the most safe locations in South Africa are mostly white, and they're living in these very secure locations, generally because they're wealthy. So it's true that South Africa has a very high murder rate. It's quite shocking, and in the 90s, it was almost the highest murder rate on earth out of 193 countries, which of course is a damning indictment of the African National Congress. That's the ruling party. They've been ruling South Africa since the end of racist rule in 1994, since they've had democracy. So there have been some gruesome slayings, and these things are reported with great prominence. And this is one of those logical, formal fallacies. This dramatic argument, looking at something which is particularly shocking, really sticks in the mind. These extreme cases, they don't tell you the general picture. Do you speak Afrikaans? I understand it's the easiest language to master if you're an English speaker. Ik kan niet die taal praten. De weer is een beetje warm. U gaat het. Okay, that's about as much as I can say. No, I can't. I have been to South Africa only once. I spent 6 weeks there when I was little. Though I do have some relations in Pietermaritzburg, Kaapstad, if you're an Afrikaner, and so forth. So, anyway, a lot more black people are killed than whites, not just in terms of numbers, but proportionately in their percentage of the population. Per capita, the murder rate for that is higher. Have just joined, have white friends in South Africa, they have major issues there. Well, I mean, I'm sure they do. As I say, there's a lot of violent crime in South Africa, which is troubling, which should worry everybody, but that does not mean there's white genocide. Now, why does anyone get murdered? It can be crime passionnel, as in, she's having an affair with my wife, or this man left whoever, or things like that. Just a row that gets out of hand, especially drink and drugs are involved. Road rage, these personal dislike, but quite often it's financially motivated, and sometimes it was just easier to rob a corpse. So there was a crime typhoon in South Africa. Rather than pull a gun and say, hand over your wallet, shoot the person dead, then get the wallet. So that was that. Of course, there are more blacks that are killed. They are around other black people. Yes, I'm also saying they are proportionally more likely to be killed than whites. So that the idea that this white genocide really is for the birds is completely bogus. And sometimes murder is due to ethnic hatred. I acknowledge that. So sometimes a white might be killed because someone hates whites because of the injustices inflicted on the black population in days of yore. Always a pleasure to listen to you, informative and entertaining as usual. Well, I aim to please. Thank you. So please ask your friends and neighbors to subscribe. I rely on donations to keep this channel going, so you can pay into me from Patreon, from PayPal, so on. I do lessons, I do guided tours. Lessons. It's all about gated communities, never stop at red lights after dark. This is my type of issues my friends speak of. Yeah, there's carjacking as well. One of my South African friends, he came out with some gallows humor, saying the great thing about driving in South Africa is, you never know who your passenger is going to be. You can be carjacked, or if you go out, so there have been a mass exodus of the European population since the black majority rule. Yeah, a lot of whites have left, because obviously until 1994 there was apartheid, as in apartness in the Afrikaans language. Afrikaans, obviously a version of Dutch. People from the Netherlands arrived there in Cape Town in 1652, establishing a vegetable garden to provision ships of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, sailing to Indonesia. By the Indies, they meant mainly Indonesia. So to give them fresh fruit and vegetables. But anyway, they stayed. And so the Dutch community had been there ever since, but they then began to call themselves Afrikaners, Africans, but they're white Africans. Anyhow, so Yeah, there was this racist system. I don't want to talk about it too much, but lawful racial discrimination against the black majority, against mixed race people, color people, that is, against the small Indian minority, and so forth. And so finally, in 1994, that was completely abolished, and they had parity between the different races. And the presidents have always been black ever since. So some of the whites found this unacceptable. They didn't want to be on an equal footing with their black compatriots, or some of them being concerned in the crimes against the black community, and they chose to leave, and blah, blah, blah. They weren't sure how things were going to go. Would they be sequestrated? Would there be vengeance? So they chose to go abroad. Now, the white bourgeoisie, a lot of them left because they're more likely to speak English. Afrikaners, in the old days, some of them couldn't speak English, or at least not very well, which really limited their opportunities to work abroad. A lot of the English-speaking whites, they were British citizens, Irish citizens, citizens of EU countries like Italy or Greece, and a lot more scope to go abroad. Or the Anglophone whites tended to be more highly educated, found it easy to get jobs abroad. They were dentists, doctors, engineers, accountants, teachers, bankers, whatever. So they moved to Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom. You find them in the UAE and so forth. But the white working class has largely remained behind. There's a tiny minority of very affluent whites, and for rich people, it's one of the best places to live in the world because property is very affordable. Hiring domestic staff is very affordable. It's got this gorgeous Mediterranean climate, and it's got such a majestic scenery, such verdure on the veldt, and some splendid beaches, just so long as you don't mind being a shark biscuit. But there's another example of hugely hyped danger. I mean, shark attacks, sharks kill 100 people a year, 200 people a year, something like that. You're far, far more likely to drown than to be killed by a shark. But it sticks in the mind so much more. It's so salient because it's so gory, so dramatic, that we focus on that one rather than something which is much more banal, which is just drowning. Even the Afrikaner Boers are leaving for other African countries, and even Russia and Georgia. Yeah, a few of them are, but I really don't know how many statistically. Black South Africans have moved abroad as well in some cases, but black South Africans get a fair chance, obviously, the past 25 years, which they didn't get before, so they're more likely to say. And it's one of the most prosperous countries in Africa. It's obviously blessed with extensive mineral resources. Why did Europeans choose to settle in South Africa much more so than any other country on the continent? And that's because of its excellent climate. It doesn't have the tsetse fly, which causes sleeping sickness to people, horses and cattle. Doesn't have it in South Africa. Good climate, not too hot, not too cold. Very fertile soil for arable farming. And in time they discovered, obviously, coal, gold, silver, cobalt, uranium, diamonds, all sorts. Anyway, so black people are sometimes killed, and sometimes the motivation is ethnic, one ethnic group against another. Yeah, whites are killed, and sometimes the motivation might be double, might be partly rob the house, but also we hate whites. Don't forget the Sharpeville massacre. Don't forget the Soweto massacre. This is not justificatory of that attitude at all. I despise that attitude. Nobody should be killed for his or her ethnicity, no matter what members of his or her ethnicity have done before. Okay, people of my ethnicity, however you choose to do that, to define that, have committed barbarous crimes. I shouldn't be held accountable for that. So I'm expressing what that attitude is. I abjure that attitude completely. Let that be understood. So some Zimbabweans have fled the economic dislocation to their country because of the terrible misrule of the ZANU-PF and Emerson Mnangagwa, 80% unemployment, hyperinflation. So these luckless Zimbabweans are seeking any sort of work in South Africa, and some black South Africans detest them, don't want them competing for their work. So unfortunately, some black Zimbabwean people have been killed, reported with far less prominence in the international press. Why? You see what the exchange rate is like. One white life is worth so many black lives. It shows you some sort of systemic bias in the mainstream Western media. So I don't know how much a crime is ethnically motivated. You have to catch the murderer and get him or her to speak frankly about it. I don't know, we're not aware of any statistics that would say, yeah, this one, it was a racist murder rather than simply an economically motivated murder. So particularly to focus on white farmers being murdered. All right, so this is the most recent statistic I've got. The years 2016 to 2017, over that 2-year period, how many white farmers were murdered? 74. Now, that's shocking. I don't want anyone to be murdered. Okay, 74 white farmers, that's quite high. So the population of South Africa is 56 million. How many of those are white? Something like 5 million. And why shouldn't it be biased? Who lives in the West? Well, all sorts of people live in the West. But I mean, I would think we would want to report things even-handedly and not focus unduly on the murder of people just because they happen to be white and overlook the murder of people who happen to be black. Aren't we all human? Shouldn't we care about people equally? Or maybe you're an inegalitarian. And there are obviously plenty of non-white people who live in Western countries. Look, even the US, only 65% white. Much depends how you define white. The UK is about 15% white, so non-white, about France, 20% non-white, and it's going to increase rapidly. Okay, look at the UK. Does that mean 15% of babies born this year are non-white? No, it'll be much higher, but like 30%, and it's going to increase and increase. And octogenarians are almost totally white, and they're dying off, being replaced by a more ethnically diverse rising generation as well as immigration. So anyway, so the idea that there's genocide against them is obviously for the birds, and the whites are sometimes killed by other whites. So there we are. Then there are people who challenge me on this, saying you're talking cack, shut up, things like that. You have no right to say this. Well, I certainly do. China needs to start reporting on U.S. random gun crime. Well, maybe they do. Obviously, there's a lot of random gun crime in the United States. So these people who are often saying that I have no idea what I'm talking about, Afrikaners for the confiscation of their land without proper compensation. I was going to come on to that, which is definitely not genocide, though. These people who say, oh, there is no genocide. Are you in South Africa? No, I'm not in South Africa. I've only been there once. Would you visit? Yeah, I would quite like to visit. I might visit next year or something. And I know it's dangerous, and I know there's some highly dangerous places, so you need to watch your step. But that doesn't mean there's genocide. So the government's not behind it either. So, but if there is genocide, you whites in South Africa who are telling me to shut my mouth, get out. Why are you still there? If you really think you're going to be killed at any moment, get out. And somebody was saying, oh, well, I don't have the money to get out. If you think it's either that or death, you would do whatever it takes. You would walk if necessary. You'd cross a border illegally. You'd rather be a beggar on the streets than get killed, wouldn't you? Especially your children as well. So it just doesn't make any sense. It's nonsense. I've been there for a month, never go back. It's a mess. Well, I'm sorry to hear that it's not doing so well according to you, but it's still one of the most developed countries in Africa. Example of how, well, decent the ANC is, and I do have my beef with them for their graft and so on. The National Party, which is the party which set up apartheid, very much an Afrikaner party, they merged into the ANC, the African National Congress. So there is a problem in South Africa. There is some anti-white animus, unsurprisingly, after what's happened. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not using understand to mean sympathize. I'm just describing the situation. I comprehend why people do it, though I vehemently oppose it. There's Julius Malema and his political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and they grew out of the frustration with the black proletariat at the failure of the ANC to properly improve the lives of black people. I mean, almost everybody's better off since the end of apartheid, partly because the end of sanctions. It's a more equitable situation. It's greater freedom of expression. The government is not kidnapping people, not torturing people. They don't have the death penalty anymore. The government doesn't have to use mass-scale violence to maintain control, or a semblance thereof. So Malema is a demagogue, and he's bad news. Is making all these inflammatory comments, well, dog whistle, these scarcely mixed messages. Doesn't want genocide at the moment, obviously hinting he'd want it later. But he is not the government. And I realize he has a significant following, like 10% of the population. And there have been some worrying chants of one settler, one bullet, kill the Boer, and so on. And people have said these are quips. I realize it may not be quite so mirthful if you're on the receiving end of it, and for some people who do not think it's a joke at all and actually go and do it. But Julius Malema, he presents a different face of the West when he's invited to address the Oxford Union. He comes across as much more reasonable. So he's very bad news. He's sort of a black version of Trump, actually. You see what Trump, him encouraging violence at rallies, it occurs. Now, no one's been murdered, actually. But, I suppose there's some Hispanic people were murdered in Texas, partly due to Trump's rhetoric. And isn't it fascinating the way the same sort of people who are promoting this bogus claim of white genocide in South Africa are often the very people who are stalwart defenders of Trump, no matter how malicious his rhetoric is, no matter how poisonous the things he says. If the problem is a loaded term, that may be a good thing for publicity attention. Which problem is a loaded term? Are the same people who are then promoting this false notion that there's white genocide in South Africa. Anyway, the false narrative of democide taking place in the Republic of South Africa is avidly promoted by racists. White supremacists seize on this. They embrace it with fervor and relish, and they are incessantly and indefatigably disseminating this false idea that white genocide is taking place in South Africa as we speak. It's part of an effort to demonize black people, to try and present them as bestial, to suggest they're dangerous. Go back to the, even before the apartheid era, the National Party in South Africa, meant to be for Afrikaner nationalism. They said, we believe in national self-determination. Whites in South Africa and black people were different nations that we've chosen to live separately, which is obviously daft, because in so-called white South Africa, the majority of people were actually black, who were deprived of various rights, such as the right to vote. But anyway, apartheid, it was partly predicated on Zwartes Gevaar, as in the black peril, as though the black majority posed an existential threat to the existence of whites, that they were too dangerous, it would be hazardous to the whites to permit equality. So suggesting that they were lower, they were scarcely human, and so on. So the most toxic racist rhetoric was used to try and justify this. Obviously, whites sometimes are bestial, do appalling things. It's not as though no white groups have committed genocide, including these other whites, but that's a little bit inconvenient for the white supremacist story. They overlook that, and indeed they might even sometimes celebrate white acts of genocide, like the Ku Klux Klan, or these absolutely evil, knuckle-dragging monsters. So there are plenty of white ogres and gargoyles in history, but we don't let that somehow besmirch the reputation of whites as a whole. Quite often it was projection, this idea of the black threat, as in the most loathsome and despicable whites projecting their own worst traits and tendencies onto black people. Well, it's a bit like Callahan's law, I'd like this one to be, that white supremacists are the people who disprove the very notion of white supremacy, because it's usually the scummiest whites, the stupidest and most malevolent ones, the most unimpressive specimens of whiteness, who promote this specious notion that whites are somehow better or more human or whatever, or the people of God. And I suppose it's those who suffer from a crushing sense of inadequacy, low education, attainment, not much money. Their skin colour is the only thing they've got left for status, and they're terribly worried about being déclassé. Like speaking to whites who were living in South Africa in the 80s, saying, you know, the white working class, they clung on to apartheid. They desperately wanted to avoid having to compete on an equal playing field with black people for jobs because they knew they couldn't. If white nationalism and segregation saves one life, it's good. Well, I don't think it does. I mean, loads of things could save one life, wouldn't be good. It would obviously claimed an awful lot of black lives when they were struggling against it, even peacefully, at Sharpeville and Soweto, and ANC activists who were kidnapped and murdered, or Steve Biko, member of Black Consciousness, not even ANC, who proposed non-violence resistance, and he was kidnapped and beaten to death with dozens of injuries all over his body. So, you know, black people could say the same. If expelling all whites saved a single life, well, then it's worth it. And no, we don't do this. We don't say we're going to ban all motor vehicles to save a single life, or we'll all have to go around with a number tattooed on our head to help the police. That would save a single life. Come on, get real. So some of the people who have propagated this myth of white supremacy, white genocide are Simon Roach, a white supremacist. Don't we what, outlaw motor vehicles? I don't think so. Or wear tattoos on our foreheads with a number so the police can identify us? No, we don't. So Simon Roach, or Roche, I think it's Roach, has gone to white supremacist rallies in the United States, and he has tirelessly spread the notion that whites are being massacred in South Africa, which obviously is a huge over-exaggeration. There are various other white nationalist groups like Suidlanders or AfriForum, which have sedulously and incessantly spread the idea, good, more attention in the United States. But the huge number of black people who are murdered in South Africa, several thousand every year, that's overlooked. That doesn't count, doesn't trouble them one bit. There's something deeply wrong about that. And this fallacy of white genocide in South Africa has been eagerly spread by Katie Hopkins, this absolute witch on British television, who's just knowingly offensive and has found a way to monetize hate. I mean, her media career ought to have been over long ago. Long ago. Okay, just occasionally she hits the mark, but overall she is loathsome, so spiteful, and just pretends though she hasn't heard things which blow her argument out of the water. Would it be attention-seeking perversity? I'm not sure it is. I really think she probably actually is that sick and does hold the views that she expresses. Thank goodness David Cameron wouldn't let her be a Conservative parliamentary candidate. So take Tucker Carlson of Fox News. I mean, what a disgrace that he gets to call himself a journalist. So this bow tie wearing wanker who, how is it good? What, race mixing? Well, nice. I like people of other races. Anybody can hit them once in a while. Yes, you're right. But generally speaking, she is just spiteful and just denying science. Like metabolism's got nothing to do with it. Nobody's obese because they're born with that metabolism or they're big boned. No, it's all weight and exercise. Weight and exercise certainly play a role, a big role, but it's not just that. There are some people who don't eat very much. They quite sensibly, they do take quite a lot of exercise and they're still heavy. There's some people very fortunate because they can eat quite a lot, they scarcely exercise, and actually their weight is low. Okay, so as though genetics don't exist, simply ignoring what any dietitian or doctor or biologist will be able to tell you. So Tucker Carlson and various hate sites have been very keen to spread abroad the idea that whites are being butchered in South Africa. And yeah, okay, some whites are being killed, but it's not genocide. It's not such a huge number, and it's certainly not proportionally huge, especially in comparison to the number of black people who are killed in South Africa when you look at their numbers in the overall population. So Tucker Carlson is the high priest of racial conflict and seems to only care about whites. He's quite open about that. And completely indifferent to the suffering of non-whites. I'm not sure I've ever heard him express any empathy for the non-whites suffering, not express the least compassion for them, only cares about whites. LM, I realized you're being sarcastic. Oh, you're an LM, I can't remember who that is. Like, this is the guy who called Iraqis monkeys and so on, and saying they wash their bottoms with their hands and things like that. So he is despicable. And he often engages in inflammatory rhetoric, thinks Hispanic people, even American citizens who are Hispanic, moving to a predominantly white town, that's somehow disastrous, as though it's the end of the world. But it wasn't catastrophic for whites to move to South Africa. No, I realized there was some white contribution to South Africa. It developed technologically a lot through the presence of whites, but there were certainly downsides for the black majority as well, such as being dispossessed. This story, the YouTuber Winston Sturzill doesn't have a good word to say about the country of his birth. He has since relocated to Shenzhen in the People's Republic of China. Yeah, I watch him quite a lot about China. He often describes himself as British, I think. But I've been to China for 2 extended trips. Do you get upset when black Americans make common cause with black Africans? Well, not particularly. I mean, I don't mind about the cause of justice everywhere. There is something that racial solidarity does worry me a little bit. I would like human solidarity. I suppose the main thing is to try and reduce suffering, to be fair, whoever it is, not say, well, because you're the same color as me, I must take your side, or you're a different color of me, I must be against you. That's just the flip side of it. But not white justice. I don't want anyone to be killed anywhere, all right? I want racial equality before law. I don't want any discrimination, and that's that. Okay, and in the old days, the black majority, they were discriminated against. They weren't allowed to go to better schools and universities under apartheid. They weren't allowed to certain cinemas and beaches, and the whites, being 20% of the population, had far more than 20% of the land, not just as private property, but as parks, as beaches, more of it and better of it, and things like that. And why shouldn't whites and black people be allowed to go to the same cinema, the same restaurant, and so on? So I was 5 and went to South Africa, and it never occurred to me in the hotel restaurant, why are all the diners white, but the waitresses are black, and so on. And so they couldn't get better paid jobs, they couldn't be diplomats, black people, and on and on. When do blacks give up the victim card? Good question. Well, I know it's overplayed sometimes. Sometimes black people are victimized. Sometimes whites were victimized. In South Africa, obviously, black people victimized a lot more to recently. But whites, still on average, are much richer than black people, 4 times richer on average. I know they started out with more wealth, with more education, or higher education had to be paid for. the two official languages were English and Afrikaans, and whites grew up almost invariably either speaking English or Afrikaans as their mother tongue. But many black people speak English and or Afrikaans fluently now. And they always will be, who will always will be victims. What black people? I don't know, doesn't necessarily have to be. I would hope not. I don't want anyone to be victimized. A little bit realistic. I realize that some people are racist. Unfortunately, it's something, a disease we'll probably never quite shake off. I don't mean it's good at all, but I wonder if to some extent it's natural, a bad element of human nature. Our instincts are not necessarily laudable. The wealth gap might always be there, and I'm not terribly troubled by a wealth gap. I would like to care about what of individual effort and merit and so on, but I realized that people were not starting with a level playing field because black people had some historical injustices to overcome when they've been disbarred from the better educational institutions, and they just had fewer economic opportunities, weren't allowed to do the better paid jobs like being mining engineers. Only whites could get blasting licenses. No, I believe it will be gone in future generations. Maybe it'll even out over many generations. So this wicked myth that there's white genocide was guaranteed to heighten racial animosity and set people at each other's throats, cause racial bifurcation, will deepen and aggravate it. And race relations can be a tinderbox. It doesn't take much to set it off. Genes will change overnight. I don't think they'll change that fast, but I don't think there's a great deal of difference between black people and white people or any different races. I think it's largely skin deep, it's appearance. I suppose it's part of the availability heuristic because it's instantly noticeable. You see what racial group people are, and then some people foolishly imagine this tells you a great deal about a person. This defines the person's personality, their abilities, their intellect, all the rest of it, how they're going to behave, when really I don't think it tells us very much. I'm a very well-traveled person. I'm a xenophile. I've been to over 90 countries, and what I've learned is that though human nature is universal, human emotion, what's very different are the rules of behavior. Cultures vary, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, the conventions, the way to behave is very different from one place to another. So some people see race relations as a zero-sum game. One group's got to have the whip hand over the other. We can't both gain. We can't all get happy, and we must be divided or think about which race people are. That really matters to some people, but to racists it does. Rather saying, it doesn't really matter. I mean, okay, I'm in this group. That's not very important to me. It's not a big part of my identity. I don't like everybody who happens to have the same skin tone as me or hair texture or facial features. I don't dislike everyone who's got it different. It should be a matter of complete indifference. I don't really care. What matters is the individual, how he or she behaves, what he or she says and does. That's what's important. Why would I care what their skin tone is? Skin tone varies through an individual's life, varies from winter to summer, depending how much sun they've had. That doesn't make you behave in a particular way. Although people might be treated differently according to their race, and that might change their behavior a little bit. So we can both gain, and wouldn't it be good if we could just lay aside racial animus and just all be good friends and neighbors and get along? I think that's the way forward. And there are people of different races who've been dear friends. And there are people of the very same race who've absolutely hated each other's guts. I used to point this out to some racists. Then you shouldn't mind all white countries. Well, I wouldn't mind as an all-white country. I don't want to create one. I wouldn't want to keep people out for being non-white. Worth bearing in mind that they enjoy relative, I've missed that. Have the levels of violence decreases the abolition of... Good question. Now, I've heard not. I don't actually have the statistics to hand. Some people say that's because the police in the apartheid era were mostly white and were largely the army of the whites to protect the whites from black people. And what black people did to each other, especially if they were poor, the white police didn't give a damn about, said, we're not going into Soweto or the other shanty towns, the Bantustans. That's your problem. You provide your own policing. And the ANC, even though it's an illegal organization, had to do it. So we just don't have statistics. The statistics were simply not collected. Partly there's very little to rob in many people's cases. They were just living in shacks, not wishing to be demeaning, but saying how it was. Some people lived in the most abject poverty. I realized in most of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, it was even worse. And I know some of the apologists for South Africa say, oh, well, South Africa under apartheid, the black community had a higher literacy rate, lower infant mortality, a longer life expectancy, a higher average income, blah, 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 than anywhere else in Africa. Yes, that's true, but not due to liberality on behalf of the apartheid government, just because South Africa has more natural resources, has more minerals and so on. and better farmland. So anyway, it is reprehensible that Carlson should promote this. The level of violence is huge now, mostly black on black. Yes, I agree. That doesn't mean that discriminating against black people is a good thing. No one should be punished because of his or her race. It's individual. Guilt is individual. We should have collective culpability. Your race, whatever it is, should you be punished just because someone who looks vaguely like you committed a crime? Should you be discriminated against? I don't think so. And this is what I pointed out to people, whites who are like this, who are supremacists. I say, have you ever disliked a white person? Sure, I have. Has a white person ever done bad to you? Yeah. All right, so should you be against all whites? Should you be discriminated against too? No. This is lunacy. So it's highly irresponsible to spread this myth of white supremacy, of white genocide, and it's deeply unethical. So it's shameful that Fox News should tolerate this sort of toxic nonsense. But how about Syrians being massacred? Tucker Carlson, he doesn't give a damn about them. Many of these white supremacists are always banging on about how terrible it is that whites are being killed in South Africa. They nary express a word of sympathy for non-whites who are suffering this. How about even in the United States, Black Lives Matter? When black people are shot dead unjustifiably by the police in the United States, where is he then, Tucker Carlson and those of his ilk? They don't give a damn about that. And they think it's absolutely outrageous that Black Lives Matter should say the police should not kill someone unless absolutely necessary. They think that's somehow anti-police or anti-white to say that. Anyway, so it's a disgrace this is going on. He's a Christian with a WASP background. Yeah, so is Tucker Carlson. What happened to the compassion, though? You know, if you believe that we're all children of God, you've got to accept the brotherhood of man. So it's disgraceful that this is promoted. I don't think he's Muslim, me neither. Someone mentioned land reform. Okay, so the whites own 72% of farmland in South Africa. Black people own 4%. Generally speaking, it's actually quite low quality farmland that they've managed to get a hold of. The ANC, since the Freedom Charter of 1955, had a commitment to land reform. I never said that, but blacks don't agree with that you are killing their neighbours from Zambia, etc., calling them foreign. Well, obviously, I'm not blaming the black community as a whole, just individuals who carry out these slayings. But it is true that some immigrants to South Africa, legal or illegal, particularly from Zimbabwe, actually, a few of them have been killed for xenophobic reasons, which is obviously detestable. I don't want anyone to be killed for his or her ethnicity, nationality. If someone immigrates illegally, all right, you shouldn't do that. You're not evil for doing it. You certainly shouldn't be killed for doing it, for goodness sake. And I obviously despise that kind of slaying as well. You met Zimbabwe. I thought so, because that's the place where the economy's been run into the ground by this dreadful kleptocracy of Emerson Mnangagwa and Mugabe. Children of God, modern liberals are a cult, facts be gone. Well, I'm citing lots of facts for you. Well, we're all human. Our DNA is almost the same, 99.99% more between white people, black people, and all the rest of it. And a black person to a white person blurs into each other, are all races. We all started out in the Rift Valley in Africa. That's a fact. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. We're all related at somewhere along the line. Facts are necessary, I agree. Well, I've cited a few to you. So the ANC want to redistribute land. I don't particularly agree with it. It wouldn't be a terrible thing to do. They pointed out the land was taken, often forcefully, in bygone centuries, and they say the autochthonous people of the country, they ought to own more of it. They think there's a terrible racial disequilibrium here, which they seek to correct. Well, they're going to rectify it through peaceful and legal means. A government is allowed to compulsorily purchase things. People do this in all sorts of countries for roads or whatever, for public goods. I think obviously, giving it to people privately. But we'll see. So, but the idea that this white genocide is a canard, and don't try and link it to the government peacefully and legally doing what any sovereign state is allowed to do. The same true of monkeys. I think it's like 99.99% chimp. There's a T-shirt saying that. But I'm going on about 9 beyond that. Okay, and you might say for that matter, okay, humans, we share some DNA, a lot of DNA with dogs and pigs and so on. Come on, get real. It is the most vile racist trope to try and liken black people to simians or saying that we're different species. We're clearly the same species. We're all Homo sapien. So there's this nefarious attempt to smear multiracial South Africa, to try and suggest that racial equality is somehow catastrophic. There's some loathsome nostalgia for apartheid, okay? And even though I think murder rates were lower in apartheid, I'm not actually sure because I suspect the statistics weren't reliable. And everybody's better off. Just about everybody's better off than they were under apartheid. Some people are a lot better off. There's now a black upper class of multimillionaires, which there weren't before. And it's good that people can be friends and socialise. They distributed the land in Zim, and the blacks just left it to go use to be the breadbasket of Africa. Now that people are hungry. Yeah, I know it was disastrous in Zimbabwe, partly because he was such a dreadful president, Mugabe. How much difference is there between a pit bull and a sheepdog? Good question. I'm not an expert on canine genetics, so I can't tell you. They look very differently. They look very different, but humans, we never look that different from each other. Look at the size of a Chihuahua compared to a Great Dane, just looking radically dissimilar. So there's more difference between them than there is between all the different races of our species. So I know in Zimbabwe it was done very badly done and given to people, cronies of Mugabe, had no wish to farm, had no experience of farming. It doesn't have to be done so badly. It's one of the reasons I think the ANC are proceeding more cautiously. They're being circumspect, seeing how to do it. A Put needs a muzzle in public. Perhaps you need one too. Never seen a Nord? No, I haven't. I don't really want to talk about pooches all the time. So people are trying to introduce the ANC, and there's a lot wrong with the ANC, like graft, incompetence. So I don't hold any brief for them, but they're not evil. So some people are going to calumniate anyone who favours equality, and they'll cite bogus statistics. They will try scaremongering. They wish to falsify the record. But I wish to set the record straight. There are these mendacious claims about a genocidal plot, as there's a certain protocol of the black people of South Africa to wipe off the whites off the face of the earth. Whites are not being annihilated. And indeed, whites have moved in there from other countries sometimes, such as Argentina. So there's no democide going on, and it's really opprobrious to cry wolf, because when a real genocide comes along, it won't be believed because of this. Just saying hi, hello there, squeezing my wife. And look at the Darfur genocide. Only 10 years ago, that was going on in Sudan. When the SA government get a different government than one party ruled by ANC, what is okay, one party is in government. It's a multi-party state, has free and fair elections, better than many other countries in the world, and a free media and an independent judiciary. So there's a lot which is very laudable about it, which is an awful lot better than was the case that pertained under apartheid. The Darfur genocide, hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered, hundreds of thousands. I don't know, there was a word about it on Fox News or by Katie Hopkins or by any of these white supremacists who are constantly pushing this false story about white genocide in South Africa. Why? Because they don't care a damn about black people, the mass killing of black people, whoever does it, Katie Hopkins, Tucker Carlson, so on, AfriForum, Soutlanders, Roach, they don't want to know because they don't care about black people at all. Shows how racist they are. You'll find a lot of far-right personalities such as Katie Hopkins claiming there's white genocide, which is a disgusting lie. I know, she's absolutely loathsome, the lowest of the low, nauseating. So I'm a race mixer, okay, in all levels, and happily marry a black lady. So bring on race mixing. If we're completely intermarried, miscegnation is completely laudable. Marry with your own race is laudable too. Marry whoever you like, or not marry, or have children, don't have children. But if we're completely racially mixed, there would be no racial differences, and therefore there could be no racial animosity. That, I suppose, would be a step forward. I wonder if that might be the only solution over the centuries to get rid of that. 87 white farmers murdered so far this year. I didn't know that statistic. Obviously, it's a horrifying statistic. I don't want any person to be murdered, white or non-white, farmer or non-farmer, but it's fascinating the way that only the white victims are getting the attention of these people, and the far greater number of black people is completely overlooked, shows a great racial bias. Anyway, that's enough. I'm going to sign off now. So I hope I've nailed the lie that there is white genocide going on in South Africa. There is not. There is no white genocide in South Africa.